To give you what's going on in the background, kingdom has split. There's a northern kingdom, which is Israel. There's a southern kingdom, which is Judah now. Syria is a persistent enemy to Israel and Judah. And we know why. We discovered in our class and studying that after the Solomon, Israel had no godly kings after that. None. God let it go on for about a little over 200 years before they were taken away. They had to pay for their sins. And so here what you have is Syria was conducting raids on Israel. Naaman is the king of Syria's main general, if you want to call him that. But that's what's going on. They've been conducting raids. So let's see what God's word has to say. We may finish a little early. We may not. We'll see. Normally in my class we don't even get through, but that's all right. Chapter 5, verse 1, this is what it says. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor. But Naaman had a problem. He had a physical condition. He was a leper. Let's look at verse 1 there for a little bit, for a few minutes. God used Syria as judgment on Israel. If you look there in verse 1, the Lord was the one giving the victory to Naaman there. And that's the reason why he was doing it. It's because of Israel's sin. You know, we don't get by with sin with God. God has warned us and warned us and warned us. But after a while, he'll do something else. And he'll do whatever he needs to do to correct us. And so he was using Naaman here to correct or punish Israel. Of course, they never came back to God. They went on and on and on. And God was long-suffering to them. Very long-suffering to them. Now, what do you know about leprosy? Skin disease. What else? Yeah, characterized by white spots on the skin. Incurable, except for divine intervention. That was the only way it was going to be cured. That was another thing.
People ignored them. They didn't want to. They put them aside or something.
Yeah. In the Old Testament, what they did with them, they put them outside the camp. They were placed outside the camp. They had to stay out there. They had to put on mourning clothes to let people know that they were sick. And if somebody came close, they had to holler, unclean, unclean. And that was their life. So you can imagine what kind of life they had. And this is where Naaman is. He's a Syrian, but he is also a leper. And like I said, leprosy was incurable. Unless God intervened, you would eventually die of it. It was a bad, I read a description of what would happen. As time progressed, I said, I'm not even going to say what that is tonight. You'll have to look that up on your own. But it is a bad way to die. But this is where Naaman is here. Look at verse 2. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. What you're going to see is two instances in this story of people who are not named. They're minor players in the story, but they have a major impact on Naaman's life. Here's one of them. It's this young girl. Now, this young girl ended up being, when they went on a raid, they brought her back here, is what they did. And so she became Naaman's wife's mistress, is what it was called. She waited on Naaman's wife, is what she done. Now, God is going to use her in a mighty way. This girl was an unwilling missionary. Do you believe that God can take something bad and turn it into something good? This is an instance of that. This young girl here, and we don't know her age. All we know is it says she was a young girl. She may have been just a teenager. Has been taken from everything she knows, everything she's ever known. Here she is in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, really. Okay? She is surrounded by enemies. This girl is an unwilling missionary. She didn't go willingly over there. She was taken captive. But she's going to become a missionary. God is going to use her. God allowed the tragedy of her captivity to accomplish a greater good. And what you see here in this girl is she is an example of the mysterious ways of God. If you study Scripture long enough, you will realize that God does things His own way, and He doesn't do them our way, because His ways are so much higher than ours. And when tragedy, it seems, has struck, God has got everything laid out. Remember Moses? Remember Moses as the baby? What happened to him? Remember what was going on? They were killing all the babies. And they put him in the river. And who found him? Pharaoh's daughter. Listen, God hid the deliverer of Israel in Pharaoh's own house.
And Moses was a basket case.
She's being funny. But God hid the deliverer of Israel in Pharaoh's own house. Didn't He? Yeah, He did. So when you look at this, that's just an example of God's mysterious ways, how He works. And this girl is an example of those mysterious ways. Verse 3. Then she said to her mistress, "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy." What do you think of this young girl? She shows a lot of faith. She shows a lot of maturity, does she not?
She had faith in God that God would, through the prophet, that God could
God could
heal.
heal him.
And she had a lot of courage to say that because that was not probably something that she wanted to say.
You've been taken out of your home by the enemy. You gonna help them out?
No.
She was concerned about her enemy too. She loved him. She
You know, if she hadn't cared about her master, she would have never said anything. Think about that a minute. She's been taken from everything she knows. But in spite of all that, she is faithful to God. The girl is a faithful witness in her current circumstances. When we're in trouble, really trouble is the only way to find out what kind of Christian we are, is it not? Yeah. I mean, because she could have become bitter. You know, blamed God, blamed her circumstance, blamed the people she was staying with, but she did not. How many times do we do that? We find ourselves in circumstances and we quit being or acting like we're saved people. Something to think about, isn't it? She could not have said anything, but she cared enough to speak up. She had enough faith to believe Elisha would heal Naaman of his leprosy. So here she speaks up. She's a minor player in the story, but she is pushing Naaman in the right direction. You know, our thing is we want God to give us something big, don't we, to do. And no. And we're not even faithful in the little things that He gives us to do. All she did was speak, look, there's a prophet from my home where he can go get help. You know, in her circumstance. You know, whatever God gives us to do, we need to do it. And we need to be faithful about doing it. This young girl was. Even in her bad circumstances that she was still faithful to an almighty God. She's an example to us tonight. And I'm going too fast. Verse 4, since y'all ain't talking. And Naaman went in and told his master, saying, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. Now, what's wrong with his gods?
He's a false god, can't do that.
That's it. He's an idol. He's incapable because he doesn't exist. He only exists in their minds. You know, think about that. Man will serve something he'll build with his own hands. I don't know about you, but I want to serve something greater than myself.
Amen.
And the only person I want to, that means the only person that fills that bill is Jesus Christ. That's the only one. That's the only one. Naaman's gods had failed him. He was desperate for a cure because he had probably seen over time what would happen to somebody in the end. And he didn't want to die like that. God, remember, he's a general. Be all right to get killed in war, but I don't want to die like this. I don't want to die like this.
No matter what position you hold, how big you think you are, God can get your attention and bring you down.
Yes, he.
Same level. Six.
Yes, he can. That, you know, if you study the scriptures long enough, there's enough examples of it in here. There's enough of them that God will bring us down no matter how high we think we are. God will bring us down. Naaman has got a lesson to learn tonight. And I hope we learn it as well.
Naaman had to experience God's healing and God's action to build her faith up even suggested. So she had to experience God doing stuff. So to speak.
Yes.
That's how we build our faith too. We trust Him to get us by a certain issue, and then it does, and we got more faith in the next time.
If he'll get me through this, then I know the next time I have something to face, he can get me through this as well. Many times what we want to do is we want him to do it our way, but that doesn't work. God's going to do it his way. And we must accept that fight. That's a hard fight to accept at times, but God's going to do it only his way. If you look at verse 5, so the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Makes me wonder why. My God doesn't work, so why won't I leave him alone? What's the definition of insanity? And wanting different results. You know, if you don't see any results from your God, maybe you need to change. If you look, the king gave Naaman his blessings. And there's a couple reasons he did that. We'll get to that in a little bit. But he gave Naaman his blessings. Matter of fact, he wrote a letter to take with him. And he took with him Now, Naaman is important to him. He's very important to him. Because if you look at the amount of money that he sent with him, it was quite a bit. In today's dollars, probably a couple $1 million. From what my Bible's got. It may be even more than that, but now, you know, gold fluctuates it in silver by the ounce. But according to this, he sent him, in today's money, a couple $1 million. Now, this is the way the world works. I'll pay for a miracle. That's what the world thinks. I got enough money, I can pay for a miracle. But that ain't the way God works.
My Bible says 750 pounds of silver and 150 pounds of gold. So
That was a lot of money. That was a lot of money. Now in verse 5, I got a question for us tonight. Why did the king of Syria send a letter to the king of Israel? Well, and tensions had actually lowered a little bit. That's what one writer I was studying behind. They were enemies, and I thought it was even strange that he sent him. But it is believed at this time, for some reason, tensions are a little bit lower. Okay? But my question is, the girl said there was a prophet in Samaria. He writes the letter to the king. Why? Show importance, okay. Anybody else?
The king is the boss of the country.
King was the boss of the country.
He could do or not do. He could send a prophet or not send.
Yep.
He has to go through the right channel to get accomplished. Yeah.
I think the battle, everything was over, because it took the maiden back, evidently they had a victory. So that king was really in charge of the other king. That's it.
Anybody else? I'm just asking for your opinion. This king should have known Elisha. Now the girl says there's a prophet in Samaria, so just by put all your answers together, you go to the king first in that country. But this king does not have a relationship with Elisha. None. But the king of Syria expects you ought to know everybody that's in your country. You ought to have a relationship with everybody that's in your country. And you don't. Because the king in here is Jehoram. He was an ungodly king. He was an ungodly king. So he had no use for the man of God. The king of Syria expected him to have, but he did not. King of Israel should know where the prophet lives and have a relationship with him, but he didn't. All this money that was sent, along with Naaman, three things. Number one, it shows how desperate his situation was. It shows how desperate it was. Number two, it shows how important Naaman was to the king. And number three, it shows that man believes he can bargain with God. God gonna heal him, I'll give him a bunch of money. God don't need our money. God doesn't need our money. But
How many times do we bargain with God? God, if you'll only do this, I'll do that.
there you go.
I'll make sure I'm at church every Sunday, God, if you'll just do this.
Yeah. We do it all the time, don't we? We want to bargain with God. That's the way the world thinks. I will pay. Somebody say something. I will pay for a miracle.
that's what a lot of people think, and that's, they take people to pray for them, and they think they can get judged with God, and
I just work, Carl.
whatever they want, it's going to be done.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't keep yourself.
Yeah. That's what I was standing here thinking. That's exactly what I was thinking about. Those preachers on television. Oh, bring your money. We'll see about helping you out.
Sing it first.
There you go. Yeah, sow a seed. So the king of Syria sent all this money. He sent this letter. And this is what the letter said. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman, my servant, to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. I thought that was interesting the way he worded it. But he expected, the king of Syria expected Naaman to be healed. I've got the money to back it up right here. But the problem is, let's see the king of Israel's response. Verse 7, we'll stay there for a few minutes. And it happened, when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. The tearing of clothes emphasizes what? Represents what? The tearing of clothes. Grief. Frustration. He's upset. He thinks the king of Syria is up to something. He thinks he's up to no good. He's been conducting raids against him, so that's what he thinks. Look at the end of verse 7 there. How he seeks a quarrel with me. That is what the king thought was going on. He thought there was a hidden agenda, in other words, that this king had. So he sent Naaman to him. But that was not it at all. Another reason he got upset, it was out of his power to heal Naaman's leprosy. It was out of his power. Not only that, he had no relationship with God. He had no relationship with the prophet of God who did have the power to heal. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I don't want nothing to do with God. He can get me out of this, but I don't want nothing to do with him. I don't want nothing to do with the man of God. So the king of Israel tears his clothes. King of Syria assumed the king of Israel had a much better relationship with Elisha than he really did. That happens to us. There's a lot of people think we got a better relationship with God than we really do. Boy, y'all got quiet when I said that.
Yeah, some people can fool you and you think that they are really close to God.
Yes.
They can put on and you think they are.
Yeah, I mean, that happens to us. People come to you, will you pray for so-and-so? I know you're a godly person, and the whole time on the inside, you're just about to bite your tongue into, because you know the truth. Well, I'm not there where I can talk to God like that. But that's what the king of Syria assumed about the king of Israel, that he had a relationship with this prophet. That is what he expected. This man can perform miracles and you don't have no relationship with him.
And he was probably thinking, this is part of God's chosen people, so the king should have a relationship, he was thinking, with God.
Exactly. This man, Elisha had a reputation. God used Elisha in a mighty way. He was getting ready to use him again. But king, you don't know this man? You don't know who he is? Verse 8. So it was, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, then he sent to the king, Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. There's a gentle rebuke in there, isn't there? You see it there in verse 8? Why have you torn your clothes? Somehow or another, the word got back to Elisha. What had happened, what the king had done. And so he tears his clothes here. There's a gentle rebuke to the king of Israel. There's Needless crisis because you could have a relationship with God. In the king's mind, this is a crisis. He's scared to death. He's scared for himself. He's scared for his country. And it's all needless. What more does God have to do to prove himself to us? What must he do? Y'all are looking at me like I'm beating you over the head.
Did it all.
Yeah, he did it all.
It's waxing colder and colder with the world. Yeah,
Yeah.
and bad shape.
What's going on here, we see it going on in our lifetime. We see it going on in our lifetime.
Lack of faith.
Lack of faith. Well, I want to try something new. Really? Seriously, I've heard that comment. I wanted to try something new, something exciting. Excitement's going to send you to hell if you ain't careful. But there was a gentle rebuke to the king. This is a needless crisis because of the king didn't have a relationship with God. And I wrote this down because one writer said this. He said, Naaman would never know there was a prophet in Israel by hanging around the royal palace. He would never know there was a prophet in Israel by hanging around the royal palace. He'd never know it. And I thought about the United States. I said, if somebody comes from a country wanting help from God, I'm going to go to the White House and see if they can point me in the right direction. Boy, they'd be in trouble, wouldn't they? I'm going to go to Congress and see if somebody can point me in the right direction. Lord have mercy. We're in trouble, aren't we? We're in trouble and we don't know it. Some of us don't know it. Same thing here. The true prophet in Israel was not welcome at the palace. He weren't welcome. And if the true prophet is not welcome at the palace, who else ain't welcome? God. If you don't want the man of God at the palace, you surely don't want God there, right? Because the man of God is just a messenger.
Amen.
So if you don't want to hear the message, you don't want God there either. You don't want him there. Anybody got any questions up to this point? Okay. No questions. No comments. Verse 9, then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of the house of Elisha. Now, this was a relatively large and impressive size delegation. They did two things. They provided security for him, and it also provided evidence of his importance. His importance is getting ready to be taken down a few notches. It really is. And God will do it. God's going to humble him.
Oh, he was way out there.
He was way out there.
His arrogance.
Yes, he was. Can you imagine what it must have been like for him approaching Elisha's house? They probably saw him coming. They had so many people with him, they probably saw him coming for a mile just because of the dust that was kicking up when he was coming. Seriously. I'm important. I'm an important person. Don't you know who I am?
Money and power, you see. Most people away from God.
So what now?
Money and power gets most people away from God.
Money and power is two dangerous
The
things.
president, the Catholic Church should excommunicate him.
Money and power are two stumbling blocks for a lot of people. They really are. Now, so he comes to Elisha's house. Now I want you to look. I've read enough about Elisha, and I get the impression he was just as calm and cool and collected as anybody you ever want to meet. Nothing fazed him. That's my impression of him. I want you to look what Elisha does. Naaman gets to his house. He stands at the door, And this is what Elisha does in verse 10. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. Oh, my goodness. I've come to his house, and he ain't even got, he won't even come out and talk to me. Exactly. He won't even come talk to me. Elisha sent a messenger and did not give Naaman a personal audience. He don't know who I am. I'm going to have to explain it to him, I guess. It wouldn't bother him. Hey, I got proof. Look at all these people with me.
And he said, I'm in need.
Well, essentially, he did say the next verses.
You know, that happens sometimes when cops stop somebody. You must not know who I am.
Let me tell you who I am.
That's not like that time Billy Graham wanted to drive a limousine. They said the driver let him drive, the cop stopped. Said, I don't know who that is, but he's important. He's got Billy Graham driving him around.
I hadn't heard that one, Drew. Now, so Elisha does 2 things in verse 10. Number 1, he sent his messenger out there. This is humbling to Naaman. He's used to being honored by the person he came to see, not a messenger. Yes, sir. Roll the red carpet out. Get ready. I'm here. So this was humbling in that respect. It was also humbling in another respect. It was humbling to Naaman because these were simple instructions. I'm a general. Don't you know what I've accomplished? You need to give me something harder to do. That's his attitude.
He was just going to speak, and he was going to be healed.
He was going to make a big pomp and circumstance about it. He was going to make a big spectacle about it. That's not what he did. He sends his messenger out. Go wash in the Jordan 7 times. Can you imagine the messenger walked out, gave him instructions, and walked back in the house? If he did?
And he probably thought that Elijah wanted to take credit for healing him too. You know, saying get the praise of others and pat him on the back. He's done it. Elijah ain't know what he's done it, God does it.
Exactly. And Naaman, okay, if Elisha comes out, does what he needs to do, boy, I can go back home and see if anybody, I know somebody else sick, I'll send them back to him. But it's not the way God works. It's not the way God works. See, we got to remember that God knows Naaman's heart. And he knows where Naaman is. Naaman not only has a physical problem, Naaman has a spiritual problem. It's all about me. And it's not. You see. Yes, he was. This was a test for Naaman. That's what this is. This is a test for him. How's he going to do? Let's look at verse 11. Let's see how well he did on the test God gave him through Elisha. But, anytime you see the word but in Scripture, it's something has changed. Something's going to be different. But Naaman became furious and went away and said, Indeed, now listen to this. I said to myself, he's talking to himself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. You see what he wanted? Somebody said a few minutes ago, this man's in desperate straits. He's in a desperate situation. But what has got the best of him? His pride. His pride has got the best of him. Don't you know who I am? He was a general. God could have cared less.
Let's have to work on God's terms, not on his terms.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he definitely has to work on God's terms and God's instructions. Yes, he does. But he didn't want that, Brother Kent. What he wanted was everything his way. Naaman thought he had it all figured out. He had it all figured out. He had it already planned in his mind what this prophet was going to do. There's even no evidence that he actually even seen Elisha. But he had it all figured out. He had rehearsed in his mind how his healing would happen. It's something, isn't it? He's rehearsed this in his mind. He was offended when it didn't work the way he expected. He was offended. Look, I don't know about y'all, but if I've got a deadly disease and that's the only way I can go get healed, I'm going down to the Jordan.
You have a double portion of love.
I'm going to the Jordan. But his pride got the best of him. Notice what else he says during verse 12. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. This is a sick man with an incurable disease. And his pride gets the best of him. I'd rather die than follow these instructions.
He was making his choice.
Sir?
He was making his choice.
He-
Just like everyone else.
He was making his choice, wasn't
You
he?
better do what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Pay the consequences.
That's right. That's what God tells us. You can either believe in me, accept my son for what he has done, or you cannot. But you will pay the consequences of your decision. If you don't accept Jesus Christ before you take your last breath on this earth, you can go to hell. That's what's going to happen. Just that plain. He thought curing his skin would involve much pomp and spectacle. Listen to this. Pride often gets in the way of people experiencing God's help. Pride often gets in the way of people experiencing God's help. Proverbs chapter 16, just a few verses. Proverbs chapter 16, verses 18 through 20 says this: Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. He who heeds the word wisely will find good, and whoever trusts in the Lord, happy is he. Pride goes before destruction. Successful and fairly righteous people by human standards find it hard to believe they need a Savior from sin. They do. Going to verse 12, if you look at it, listen to this. God's instructions were simple but specific. They were simple, but they were specific. In other words, God expected Naaman to do exactly what he told him to do. Because look in verse 12. He fusses about it. Hey, I could have went down to the river back home. Is basically what he said. That's not what God said do. God said, no, you go to the Jordan and you dip 7 times. So we are to follow God's instructions to the letter.
Even when we think they don't make any sense.
Especially when they don't make any sense to us.
You You know, like Brother Roger said, and I don't know it either, but that one was nasty. Is that what you said, don't you remember?
Water was cleaner, water's
Muddy.
only there.
Mm-hmm.
In order for us to get God's blessings, it's something we always have.
Something we always have to do.
All that is instructions, we never have.
Yes. And those instructions were specific to him.
We never got saved, we had to follow the instructions.
That's right. That's exactly it.
Jesus Christ is finished work. Any other way don't work.
No other way works. No other way works. It doesn't. You know, many times, when Mama brought the point up, many times God comes and asks us to do something that makes no sense to us. Think about Abraham. What did God tell him to do with Isaac? Take him and do what? Go kill him. Now, wait a minute, Lord. Now, you've told me he's my heir. Now you're telling me to kill him? Yeah. It made no sense to Abraham. But he was obedient.
They told Moses to speak to the rock, but he was disobedient.
He was disobedient.
Water still came out of the rock, but Moses didn't go to the rock.
Exactly. Moses was not allowed into the promised land.
I always felt sorry for him on time. He went through a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, God gives us instructions that makes no sense to us. But he doesn't ask us to figure them out for them to make sense to us. What he asks us to do and commands us to do is follow him, to trust him. And obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. So here Naaman, he's having a hard time. To Naaman, if the cure was simply washing in a river, there were better rivers in his own land. This is not what God commanded. How can our let me ask you something. When you come to God, do y'all have preconceptions? You understand what I'm asking? You've already got in your mind what God, when you're going to ask God for something or ask him to do something, you've already got it in the back of your mind how he ought to work. Don't do that. Don't do that. How can our preconceptions about God, how he ought to work, hinder us from receiving what the Lord has for us? Don't never, ever assume how God's going to work. Most of the time you're going to be wrong. Just about, you might as well say all the time you're going to be wrong. So Naaman's upset. He's in a rage. He's left. He's gone. He's furious. He's mad. This man has attacked, in his mind, this man has attacked his pride. Is what he's done. He's attacked his pride. 13, I want you to look at this. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean? You know, I said the young girl was a minor player in this, but she had a major impact. Here you see another instance of that. Somebody, thank God, let me read this. Thank God for faithful subordinates who will speak truth to their superiors. Do we have friends who will speak truth to us? You know, Naaman's emotions have gotten the best of him. But yet he has surrounded himself with some wise servants. He has surrounded himself with some wise servants. And it's a good thing. You know, their name's not mentioned in here. The young girl's name is not mentioned in here, but both play a critical part in Naaman getting healed. This is why we need wise and godly people around us. We need to surround ourselves with wise and godly people. who are not afraid to tell us the truth, even if it's going to hurt. Especially if it's going to hurt. Because the request was easy to do and humbling, Naaman first refused. He first refused. But notice what they said in verse 13. My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, there's his pride. I'm a man of valor. That's what it said in verse 1. He was a man of valor. He had earned that in great fights. And here, all God is asking him to do is just go down to the river and duck himself 7 times. That's all.
Him and Moses would have gotten along good together.
They probably would have, hadn't they? So it is a good thing to surround ourselves with wise and godly people who don't mind telling us the truth. And that's what they did here in verse 13. Lastly, look at verse 14. Naaman finally heeds the wise and godly advice. So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child. Now, can you imagine what it was like for him being dunked in that water? Every time he went down, it was a step of faith, wasn't it? Each time. But also, every time he went down, a little more pride had to be swallowed. Yeah. It was each time he went under. Each time. It was a
Probably said this ain't working. About the second time.
God's instructions were specific, 7 times. So each time was a step of faith, but also a little bit more pride had to be swallowed every time he went under.
Might have been fuzzy when he first started.
He probably was coming up to the river under his breath, like we like to do. Naaman's response of faith was rewarded. Now, I want you to look at something in verse 14, what God has done for Naaman. At the end of 14, it says this, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Notice that he did not restore his flesh to his age. Notice he restored his flesh, according to the Bible, to that of a what? A little child. God did above and beyond what was expected of him.
And being like a little child, it was best for us.
He did not have the flesh of his age. He had the flesh of a little child. Telling us tonight that God went above and beyond what was expected. He restored his flesh to that of a little child. Naaman had to, and this is our problem. I want you to listen to this. Naaman had to trust God and get himself out of the way. For him, what was in the way was his pride. And he had to get it out of the way so God could do what he needed to do. And lastly, the miracle performed without Elisha there gave God all the credit. There was no waving of hands. There was no pomp and circumstance. There was no big spectacle made. All he did was went down to the river and dunked 7 times. And his flesh was like a little child's. And God got all the credit for it. And that should be our attitude. Let God have all the credit. Let him have it. Just be thankful that he lets you be a part of it. You know, just let him have all the credit. And that's what happens here.